In Ukraine, we have special language police that enforces Ukrainian everywhere. If you speak Russian, you go to prison, where you conjugate Ukrainian verbs for 12 hours a day and get whipped for every mistake you make. If it sounds insane, it's because it is. It's not true. Russia has invented a lot of excuses to justify invading Ukraine, and the supposed oppression of Russian speakers is one of the most persistent ones. The narrative is so widespread that I've heard foreigners explain to Ukrainians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians born and raised in the country, that they are somehow oppressed. The good news is that Ukrainian laws are publicly available and anyone can read them. So today we will look at the so-called oppression of Russian language in Ukraine, the broader history behind the language question, and even some of my personal experiences. The Ukraine oppressing Russian language narrative didn't just appear overnight. It was cultivated for decades, growing out of policies and ideas that go back long before Soviet Union to the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was established in November 1721 and lasted until the proclamation of the Russian Republic in September 1917. The majority of modern-day Ukraine was absorbed into Russia, with the left bank joining in 1667 and the right bank annexed after the partition of Poland in 1793. Ukraine was treated as a conquered territory, which meant cultural assimilation, legal subjugation, and economic exploitation. Policies were designed to erase a distinct Ukrainian identity and rebrand the population as Little Russians, a subgroup of the all-Russian nation. Sounds familiar, right? Russian policies never evolved since 17th century. So anyways, what do you do when you want to erase a nation? You erase the language. In 1720, Peter the Great issued a decree restricting the use of Ukrainian in religious texts and publications. It was one of the first major steps toward pushing the language out of public life. Just a few years later, in 1729, Peter II ordered that official documents be rewritten from Ukrainian into Russian. The pressure only intensified under Catherine II, who banned teaching in Ukrainian at one of the most important cultural centers of the time, the Kyiv Mohyla Academy. By the 19th century, these policies became even more explicit. In 1863, Interior Minister Pyotr Valuyev issued a decree severely restricting the publication of Ukrainian language books, claiming,
"No separate Little Russian language ever existed, does not exist, and shall not exist."
And in 1876, the Ems Ukaz under Alexander II went even further, banning the import of Ukrainian publications as well as theater performances, song lyrics, and public readings in Ukrainian. Modern equivalent of this would be banning songs, books in a language, banning it on TV, radio, social media, and then denying that it even exists. Fast forward to 1917, the Russian Empire collapses and Ukraine makes its first real attempt to break free from Russian dominance, but fails and gets dragged into the Soviet Union. Remember, Russian policies do not evolve, so USSR keeps the tradition of denying Ukrainians as people. The lives of countless Ukrainian cultural figures were destroyed for their pro-Ukrainian stance. They are now known as the Executed Renaissance. The spring of 1933 is widely considered the beginning of the Soviet Union's systematic destruction of the Ukrainian intelligentsia. Artists, scientists, writers, anyone associated with Ukrainian culture lived under constant threat of being accused of Ukrainian bourgeois nationalism. Schools were forced to switch from Ukrainian to Russian. Ukraine was removed from administrative use, documentation, and gained a second-class status. The state was doing everything to frame Ukrainian language as the rural dialect of the uneducated villagers, basically to marginalize it, while Russian was promoted as the language of culture, science, and urban life. Russia's centuries-long attempts to erase Ukrainian language have also shaped newly independent Ukraine. For many years, Ukrainian music, TV, and other industries were predominantly Russian-speaking. The country's largest newspapers were also published in Russian, and streets and monuments across Ukraine were named after Russian leaders. Still on paper, Ukrainian was the only official language of Ukraine. During this period, Russia occasionally complained, but it wasn't the central narrative yet. I want to quote Lina Kostenko, one of the most prominent voices of the Soviet-era generation, known as the Six Seers. These were artists and intellectuals who resisted cultural suppression in the USSR, where Ukrainian language and identity were systematically pushed out of public life. In Notes of a Ukrainian Madman, she describes the atmosphere of Ukraine's early years of independence.
"A dull hostility surrounds our language, even now, in our own country. We already feel like a minority. Anyone can insult you. I can't take a step without drawing attention. Sometimes it's even positive, but that doesn't make it any easier, because there's something unnatural, something humiliating in the very nature of that attention.
I was born in the late 90s and I still remember the time when speaking Ukrainian was considered not cool. My family is from the central Ukraine, where people speak either Ukrainian or Surzhyk, which is a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian. And even there, in a Ukrainian-speaking region, Russian had a certain status. So when we played pretend as kids, we would switch to Russian when we wanted to sound like cool characters. So even then, when I was 6, I already felt shame attached to my own language. And Russian isn't even that close to Ukrainian. To put it in perspective, Belarusian is actually much closer to Ukrainian, and even though I can understand it, I can't speak it. But every Ukrainian can speak Russian. That didn't happen naturally. Our entire media space was saturated with Russian content. The shows on TV were either Russian or dubbed in Russian. Russian rap was playing everywhere. It was the default sound of modern and cool. I started reading in Russian when I was around 5-6 years old, and it wasn't easy because alphabet is not the same, different letters, different pronunciation. I mispronounced a lot of words, but I still learned it. And later, when social media became a thing and I was a teenager, all the cool kids posted only in Russian, even though all of them were Ukrainian speaking. In big cities, people who spoke Ukrainian were often looked down on and told to speak a normal language. The idea that Ukrainian was the language of the uneducated still lingered. And sometimes, if you spoke Ukrainian, people would even assume your political views. And here I want to show you another quote from The Notes of a Ukrainian Madman, a novel with a fictional narrator, but the one that captures the spirit of that time very accurately.
At work, they respect me. The team is fine. At first, they looked at me sideways. They thought I was a nationalist. That's how it is with us. If you speak Ukrainian, you're automatically a nationalist. But then they got used to it. Some of them would switch to Ukrainian themselves, but that would almost be an act of civic courage. It was like that in Soviet times, and it's still like that now.
A major shift began during the Euromaidan revolution of 2013-2014. What started as a student-led protest in Kyiv was triggered by then-President Viktor Yanukovych's sudden decision to abandon an association agreement with the European Union under pressure from Moscow. It quickly evolved into a nationwide movement against corruption, authoritarian governance, and Ukraine's political dependence on Russia. Millions of Ukrainians took the streets over the country's direction, whether it would move toward democratic institutions and European integration or remain within Russia's sphere of influence. It was a turning point not only politically but culturally as Ukrainians began reclaiming their language and identity. That's also when the language became politically explosive. As Ukraine moved to strengthen its own language and identity, a very different narrative began to take shape, especially in Russian media and political discourse. According to that narrative, Ukraine wasn't reclaiming its language, it was suppressing another one. The claim suggests that people are no longer allowed to speak Russian freely, that it has been pushed out of public life entirely, and in some versions, even out of private life. The idea in here is that if you are a Russian speaker in Ukraine, you are treated as a second-class citizen. You are denied opportunities, pressured to change your language, or even targeted politically or socially. In some versions, this is described as oppression, in others as ethnic or cultural cleansing, and in the most radical framing as genocide against Russian speakers. Variations of these claims have appeared in international discussions, including in Western media, often without context, simplified, oversimplified, and sometimes presented as part of both sides' framing of the conflict. So for many people outside of Ukraine, the idea that Russian speakers are somehow under pressure didn't come only from Russian sources, but it was reinforced through global coverage. So let's take this narrative and test it against actual Ukrainian legislation. First, let's look at the Constitution of Ukraine, the highest legal authority that defines language policy in the country. Article 10 states,
"The state language of Ukraine is the Ukrainian language. The state ensures the comprehensive development and functioning of the Ukrainian language in all spheres of social life throughout the entire territory of Ukraine. In Ukraine, the free development, use, and protection of Russian and other languages of national minorities of Ukraine is guaranteed. The state promotes the learning of languages of international communication. The use of languages in Ukraine is guaranteed by the Constitution of Ukraine and is determined by law."
Yes, Ukrainian is a state language. That's normal. Every country has a state language. At the same time, the Constitution explicitly guarantees the free use, development, and protection of Russian and other minority languages. I think this is what's so annoying for Russians, that Russian is called a minority language and not a master language. The first law that will later feed into Russian propaganda was adopted in 2012 under the rule of pro-Russian President Yanukovych and allowed regional languages to be used officially if at least 10% of the population in a region spoke that language. If that threshold was met, the language could be used in government offices, courts, education, and official documents. This law overwhelmingly benefited Russia because it already dominated in some eastern and southern regions, and those regions quickly declared Russian a regional language. At the same time, it weakened Ukrainian in its own country, because even though Ukrainian remains the only state language according to the constitution, many institutions switched back to Russian, and that made Ukrainian less visible in public life in some regions. The law triggered mass protests as many Ukrainians saw it as another step toward Russification. After the Euromaidan revolution, the Ukrainian parliament voted to repeal the law in February 2014, but the acting president Alexander Turchenov did not sign the repeal, so the law remained in force temporarily. Russia immediately used this moment to claim Ukraine is banning Russian language. So let's summarize what happened here. Ukrainian is the only state language of Ukraine. Russian is fully allowed, widely used and protected as a minority language. But apparently that wasn't enough, so in 2012 it even received special privileges that let it dominate entire regions. And the moment Ukrainians started saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't get our language sidelined in our own country, Russia started screaming oppression. Because apparently now not getting special treatment counts as discrimination. At this time, Russian media was already full of headlines like, and I'm quoting, "Repressions against the Russian language in Ukraine. Up to 40% of Ukrainians may be left without the right to use Russian. Ukraine, Russophobia, repression, genocide." Even though the repeal was never signed and legally nothing changed at the time, Russia used it as a part of its justification for annexing Crimea and later supporting separatists in Donbass. It's worth mentioning that after the events of February-March 2014, the UN sent a monitoring mission to Ukraine that found no evidence of widespread or systematic persecution of Russian speakers. So there was no factual basis for the protection of Russian speakers narrative. In 2019, after 5 years of the hybrid war initiated by Russia in the eastern Ukraine, Ukraine adopted the law on the functioning of Ukrainian language as the state language. The law that is constantly being used as a proof that Russian speakers are oppressed, even though it does one thing. It establishes Ukrainian language as the mandatory language of public life. It's also worth mentioning that it explicitly does not apply to private communication or religion. It means that government, courts, education, and media operate in Ukrainian, which, by the way, is completely normal. The law also applies to businesses. They must serve customers in Ukrainian by default. For me, as an average Ukrainian, that simply means that when I walk into a store, a lawyer's office, a school, or any other institution, I have the right to be served in Ukrainian, unless I personally choose another language. And that's a very important distinction. The law does not ban the Russian language. It doesn't ban any language. What it does is guarantee my right as a Ukrainian citizen to be served in the language of my country. The same applies to education. Other languages are not banned, but they are used alongside Ukrainian, not instead of it. In media, Russian isn't banned either, but if there is a Russian language edition, there must also be an equivalent Ukrainian version. So let's see what this law actually does. It says that state language of Ukraine is Ukrainian, public services start in Ukrainian. I mean, you can still request to be served in Russian if you want. You are free to use any language in private. Other languages are allowed, used, and protected. And somehow it still gets translated into oppression of Russian speakers, Russian language is banned, and cultural genocide. For example, here's how a relatively recent article from a Russian state-aligned outlet describes the exact same law. It has been 5 years since President Petro Poroshenko signed the 2019 language law, formally set in Ukraine, on a path toward the complete removal and ban of the Russian language, a process that began right after the 2014 coup. Never miss the chance to take something out of the context and exaggerate. Unfortunately, even today, a lot of foreigners are still very susceptible to Russian disinformation. But anyone in Ukraine who speaks Ukrainian knows that the only language that has ever been systematically pushed out of public life was Ukrainian. And maybe that's why restoring it now gets called oppression. At the same time, it would be dishonest to pretend that language tensions don't exist in Ukraine today. In 2022, Ukrainian language usage saw a sharp increase, with roughly 71% of citizens using it in everyday life, up from 64% in 2021. The invasion accelerated the shift away from Russian, with approximately 58% of people speaking Ukrainian at home by the end of 2022, while 31% used both and only 9% used only Russian, according to Statista. For many people, switching to Ukrainian became a conscious choice, a rejection of centuries of Russification, and a way to distance themselves from the aggressor. But for others, especially for those who grew up speaking Russian, this shift sometimes felt like a pressure or even an attack on their personal identity. That's where a lot of the current debates come from. Some argue that language is inseparable from politics, especially now when Russian is the language of the country that is actively invading Ukraine. Others insist that language is just a tool of communication and shouldn't define somebody's beliefs or loyalty. There are also deeply personal experiences shaping these views. Some Ukrainian soldiers who returned from Russian captivity say they are triggered by the language they were tortured in. Others reject that idea entirely and maintain that no language should be blamed for the actions of a state. So nobody denies those conversations, they exist. They are very real, sometimes very emotional, and sometimes even divisive. Even my family and I, we argued about that so many times, even though each one of them is Ukrainian speaking. And this is exactly where Russia steps in, because Russian propaganda always uses existing divisions. For example, just last winter, an empty bot account posted a screenshot on Threads claiming that a student in a school in Lviv didn't receive a St. Nicholas Day gift because she was Moscow-moused, meaning she spoke Russian. There was no school name, no teacher name, and no child was identified. It was posted as a screenshot of a chat between a parent and a teacher refusing to give a present to a Russian-speaking kid, supposedly. And yet, because it touched on a sensitive issue, it spread quickly and outraged a lot of people. It became proof for some that Russian speakers are being discriminated against. But then the account just disappeared, and when people actually looked into it, there was no evidence that the incident had ever happened. We can make a very crucial distinction. What exists in Ukraine today are social debates and emotional reactions, not state policy. The law guarantees language rights. Society is still figuring out how to navigate them in the middle of a war. And then there is also Russia, who is constantly utilizing social media to fuel the tension. As a citizen of Ukraine, I strongly support Ukrainian as a state language. I want to have the right to be served in Ukrainian in my own country. I want to be able to pick up any printed edition in Ukrainian, and I want to hear Ukrainian when I turn on TV. I also want to see more Ukrainian artists being supported and developed. And then at the same time, I also want something very simple. Not to be looked down on when I speak Ukrainian in a private conversation. And if another person wants to speak Russian, it's okay. We can still understand each other perfectly well, even when we are speaking different languages. Russia spent centuries banning the Ukrainian language, calling it a dialect, restricting its use, erasing it from public life. And now, when Ukraine finally says, our state will function in our language, suddenly it's called oppression. And I understand that the concept of protecting a language might seem very confusing and unnecessary for the people who speak a language that has never been targeted, a language that nobody tried to erase. But Russia, they know what they are doing. A good example is Belarus. Belarusian is officially recognized as a state language alongside Russian, but in reality only about 10–23% of the population uses it in daily life. UNESCO has even classified Belarusian as a vulnerable endangered language, and despite its legal status, people who actively use Belarusian can face discrimination, or in extreme cases pressure during political persecution. And this is exactly why language matters politically to Russia. The language people use shapes what they watch, what they read, what narratives they are exposed to, and how they understand the world. When Russian dominates the public space, Russian media, Russian culture, and Russian political messaging follow. In Belarus, this dominance has helped keep the country deeply embedded in Russia's cultural and informational sphere, and that makes political control easier, because people are living in the same narrative space. From Russia's perspective, this is extremely valuable. A country that functions in Russian is a country that remains at least partially within its orbit, and the opposite is also true. When Ukraine strengthens Ukrainian in public life, it's not only a cultural shift but also a political one. It's one step away from Russian influence and toward independence, not only in territory but also identity. And that's why the language question is targeted so aggressively. Today I've been quoting Notes of a Ukrainian Madman a lot, and honestly it's one of my favorite books ever that unfortunately hasn't been translated into English. And I would like to wrap up this video with another quote from the book that reads, "Nations don't die from heart attacks. First, they lose their language." Thanks for watching this video until the very end. Thanks for surviving the internet today. Give me a like if you liked this video, comment and let me know what other topics you'd be interested in hearing about. Well, and praise the algorithm.